Hey guys! Today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. July 29th, 2016 began like any other day for Gabriela and her younger sister, Sunilda. That evening, they had planned to head to a nearby internet cafe to do some schoolwork. There was no internet at home, and this had become a routine part of their lives. Trips to the local cafe were their way of staying connected and keeping up with assignments. Around 6 p.m., the sisters left the house without raising any concerns. But just a few blocks away, Gabriela suddenly changed her plans. She told Sunilda she wasn't going with her after all. She was going to meet up with her boyfriend. Sunilda was a bit surprised, but didn't press the issue. It wasn't the first time Gabriela had gone off on her own. Gabriela reassured her that she'd be back soon and walked off in the opposite direction. That was the last time the sisters saw each other. Sunilda arrived at the cafe alone. Later that evening, when she returned home, she noticed Gabriela still wasn't back. At first, no one thought much of it. Teens tend to stay out late, especially during the summer. But as night fell, concern began to grow. Their mother, Liliana, tried calling Gabriela, but there was no answer. Messages on WhatsApp went unread at first, then suddenly showed as seen, but no replies ever came. Someone was clearly reading them, just not responding. Panic truly set in when someone showed up at their doorstep. A young man the family believed to be Gabriela's boyfriend. He asked if they knew where she was. His question stunned everyone. They thought she was with him. His confusion didn't seem staged. He genuinely appeared to have no idea where she could be. That moment changed everything. Up until then, everyone assumed Gabriela had simply stayed out longer than usual. But if her boyfriend hadn't seen her that night, maybe she never made it to him at all. That was when the family realized something was wrong. Sunilda recalled seeing Gabriela turn a corner toward an area where a relative had once stayed at a boarding house. It hadn't seemed important at the time. By the next morning, it was clear Gabriela had vanished. Her phone was still on, but all calls went unanswered. The atmosphere at home turned tense. Her loved ones began calling everyone they could think of, relatives, friends, even her father. But no one had any idea where she could be. It was as if she had disappeared without a trace. The family decided to take formal action. Liliana contacted local authorities, and a missing person case was officially opened. Flyers began appearing on the streets. Friends, neighbors, and strangers joined the search. But no one had seen Gabriela after she turned that corner, leaving her sister behind. Gabriela Villarroel was born in 1998 in Argentina, to parents of Bolivian descent. Her mother and father separated when she was only 6. After the split, Gabriela stayed with her mother, Liliana Cham, and eventually began referring to another man, Cesar Garcia, as her father. He became her stepfather. Sunilda and other relatives on Liliana's side also lived in the same household. Life at home wasn't easy. The family did their best to maintain stability and meet basic needs. But the atmosphere inside was often tense. Disagreements were frequent. Gabriela had particularly strained interactions with her grandmother, and their arguments went far beyond typical household disputes. The emotional distance and lack of understanding from adults made her feel constantly under pressure. As a teenager, Gabriela dealt with the usual challenges of growing up. But in a home with no personal space or privacy, those feelings intensified. There wasn't a proper environment for rest or studying. Her dream was to move in with her biological father, who lived separately with another family. But that wish never came true. He didn't maintain consistent communication, and he was dealing with personal issues of his own. At some point, the tension at home became unbearable. Gabriela made a decision. She and her younger sister, Sunilda, would leave. They found temporary shelter at the home of their aunt on their father's side, a woman named Marisol. It wasn't a carefully planned escape and had no long-term goals, but it served as a signal. Something wasn't right. The sisters stayed with their aunt for about a week. Life there was calmer, and the adult supervision wasn't as intense. But this short break didn't lead to lasting changes. After returning to their mother's house, Gabriela found herself back in the same atmosphere of pressure and stress she had tried to escape. Despite her quiet nature, Gabriela showed signs of independence. She dressed simply, didn't seek attention, and didn't hang out in loud or rowdy crowds, but that didn't mean she lacked ambition. She often thought about the future, one in which she could live life on her own terms. But limited resources made those dreams difficult to pursue. There was no computer at home, no reliable internet. Even basic tasks like doing schoolwork meant walking to the nearest internet cafe, which, as previously noted, involved extra planning and often led to stress at home. In addition to the daily challenges, Gabriela struggled with a deep sense of emotional distance. Her words were often overlooked, and her needs rarely prioritized. Even among her own relatives, she felt more like an outsider than a true part of the family. She didn't have an open conflict with her mother, Liliana, but Liliana was constantly overwhelmed with responsibilities and often failed to notice the signs of what her daughter was going through. Gabriela's relationship with her stepfather was also distant. He did what was expected of him, but there was never a real bond between them. All of this built up over the years, creating in Gabriela a persistent feeling of isolation. She didn't feel secure at home, but she also didn't see any realistic path to support or change elsewhere. Life felt like a closed loop, where any progress had to come solely from her own efforts. The household lacked the resources, emotional warmth, and space that might have supported her growth. As a result, her desire for independence wasn't just about growing up, it became a necessity. Over time, this mindset shaped her actions and decisions. It was against this emotionally vulnerable but outwardly composed background that a chain of events began. Events that would later lead to devastating consequences. Nestor Quintana was born in 1986. He was married to Elizabeth Cham, Gabriela's maternal aunt. Technically, this made him part of the family. Gabriela interacted with him regularly in their shared household. Up until a certain point, no one in the family had expressed concerns about his behavior. He was seen as calm, reliable, and employed in a respectable job. He worked for the Argentine Prefecture, a federal security agency. He didn't raise any red flags. He stayed out of arguments, helped with household chores, and was present at family gatherings. His presence blended into the background of daily life. He lived in the same home with his wife and her relatives. He shared meals, joined in family events, and contributed to the household routine. To those around him, he seemed like a steady, low-profile adult who played his role in family matters without overstepping boundaries. But over time, small, isolated incidents began to surface, little moments that didn't immediately set off alarms. A strange comment here, an odd situation there. Nothing concrete, but taken together, these details started to change how people perceived him. After he and Elizabeth separated, Nestor moved out of the family home. He relocated to a low-cost boarding house not far from the neighborhood where the family still lived. At the time, his relatives assumed it was just the natural next step following the end of a marriage. But this move marked a turning point. It was the beginning of a new phase, one in which his behavior gradually shifted from neutral to unsettling, even if no one could yet put that discomfort into words. Although Nestor no longer lived under the same roof as the family, he continued interacting with them, especially with Gabriela. Over time, witnesses began to notice he was spending more and more time alone with her. These encounters happened outside the home in neutral locations. Neighbors who observed some of these moments weren't sure what to make of them. One man recalled seeing them on a bus together. Gabriela was sitting on Nestor's lap, and he was gently stroking her hair. The man found it unsettling, but didn't say anything to the family. He later admitted he hesitated out of fear. He didn't want to cause a scene or damage relationships within the family, so he chose to remain silent. Other residents of the neighborhood reported similar observations. Several people had seen Gabriela near the boarding house where Nestor was living. Sometimes she entered the building and stayed for an hour or two before quietly leaving. No one raised concerns at the time. Since Nestor had previously been married to Gabriela's aunt, their interactions didn't initially seem suspicious. Trust in established family roles shielded those meetings from scrutiny. Gabriela never mentioned visiting him, and there was no visible reason to suspect anything inappropriate. There was no formal connection between them. Nestor wasn't her guardian and had no legal authority to be involved in her life. Still, he wasn't fully removed from the family circle, and his actions were seen as personal choices rather than something that needed oversight. Gabriela's family didn't closely monitor her whereabouts, assuming she was spending time with friends or handling errands. Later, it would come to light that many of their meetings took place at the boarding house. Nestor had rented a small room and regularly invited Gabriela there. These visits were discreet. She came alone and left quietly. The nature of their relationship gradually moved into territory that could no longer be explained by family closeness. But at the time, none of the adults realized how deep that connection had become. Even after his marriage to Elizabeth ended, Gabriela continued seeking contact with him. She never spoke about what happened during those visits and didn't share details with anyone. Only after she disappeared would the full picture start to emerge. Pieces that had previously gone unnoticed by those around her. At first, there was no clear indication that Gabriela had any reason to keep secrets. She didn't seem anxious or combative with her relatives. But in time, it would be revealed that the nature of her involvement with Nestor couldn't have been openly discussed. Their connection reportedly began when Gabriela was just 13. At that point, Nestor was already a grown man, employed in a federal security role, and married to her maternal aunt. This made the situation especially concerning. He wasn't just a stranger, he was a trusted adult in her home, connected to her family, and perceived as safe by everyone close to her. The first pieces of this story started surfacing once the investigation began. Friends who had never paid much attention to Gabriela's private life began to speak out. Several admitted they had suspected for years that something wasn't right between her and Nestor. Some recalled seeing him near Gabriela's school repeatedly, offering rides or finding reasons to be there. What started as gestures of concern later seemed more like obsessive behavior. His actions didn't match what would typically be expected of a relative. He monitored her social life, tracked who she was talking to, and showed signs of jealousy. Gabriela tried to maintain normal interactions with friends, but Nestor's involvement increasingly restricted her freedom. According to those close to her, he constantly checked up on her, sometimes calling her repeatedly when she didn't respond right away. His intense desire to know where she was at all times became a red flag for those who witnessed it. In messages that would later serve as evidence, he accused her of being distant, demanded explanations, and insisted she account for her time if she wasn't with him. These weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern of controlling and obsessive behavior. Classmates recalled situations where Gabriela would skip events unless she had his approval. On the surface, it looked like she was just dealing with strict family rules or complicated home life. No one imagined the real reason was pressure from an adult man who had created an environment of constant control around her. One of her close friends later remembered that Gabriela had once quietly admitted she hadn't felt free in a long time, but asked her not to tell anyone. At the time, it sounded like a typical teenage complaint. Only later would those words take on a much deeper meaning. From the voice messages Nestor sent Gabriela, investigators came to a chilling realization. He viewed her as someone he had a claim over. His tone in those recordings swung from pleading to demanding. He accused her of being unfaithful, suspected her of lying, and demanded constant proof of loyalty. When Gabriela started socializing with someone her own age, Nestor's behavior became increasingly hostile. He made it clear he couldn't stand the idea of her being close to anyone else, even her peers. According to the investigation, tensions between them intensified during this period. Gabriela began distancing herself, while Nestor tried even harder to reassert control. Conversations with her friends revealed that her emotional state had started to decline. She became more anxious, withdrawn, and avoided discussing her future. Her efforts to break away from Nestor were met with heightened manipulation. He used psychological pressure, emotional blackmail, threats, and guilt. Relatives living nearby had no idea this was happening. On the surface, Nestor appeared calm and composed. He never acted out in front of others. He maintained two separate images: respectable uncle in front of the family and obsessive controller in private. This double life allowed him to keep everything hidden for years. When investigators started examining his actions more closely, the pattern became undeniable. He hadn't just crossed personal boundaries, he had deliberately built a relationship of dependence, using his age, authority, and the trust placed in him by the family. Gabriela's friends would later admit they sensed something was wrong, but never realized the full extent of the situation. Her silence was rooted in fear, shame, and the belief that no one would believe her if she spoke up. That quiet fear gave Nestor the power to maintain control for years. Gabriela, growing up in a home where she didn't feel fully supported, became a vulnerable target. He entered her life as a relative and turned into an overpowering figure she couldn't escape. This dynamic laid the foundation for the tragedy that was slowly unfolding. When Gabriela went missing, law enforcement began the initial round of questioning. Her sister, her mother, the young man she had been seeing, and several acquaintances were all interviewed. Officers started canvassing the area, speaking to residents who lived within a few blocks of where Gabriela had last been seen with her sister. Some witnesses reported seeing her later that evening walking down the street with a man. One recalled the two of them heading in the direction of the boarding house. Based on the time and location, investigators formed a theory. Gabriela may have gone there intentionally. At the same time, tips started coming in from Gabriela's friends, some of whom had previously been too afraid to speak up. The more information they gathered, the clearer it became. Gabriela's disappearance wasn't a random event. It didn't resemble a runaway case or an impulsive decision. She didn't pack any belongings, and she hadn't told anyone she was planning to leave. Once Nestor Quintana came into focus, authorities brought him in for questioning. At first, he appeared confident. He claimed he hadn't been in contact with the family for a long time, that he had no idea what Gabriela's life was like anymore, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He pointed to his divorce from Elizabeth as a reason for staying away from family matters. On the surface, his answers seemed consistent, but investigators quickly began to uncover contradictions. Eyewitness statements from neighbors and residents indicated that Nestor continued to meet with Gabriela. Reports of their regular encounters near the boarding house and testimonies from her friends describing controlling behavior directly contradicted his earlier claims. Investigators intensified their questioning. Nestor was brought in again, and with each interview, his confidence seemed to erode. He started confusing timelines, changing versions of events, and dodging direct questions. Even those who had initially doubted his involvement began to grow suspicious. The turning point came a few days after the investigation gained momentum. Nestor unexpectedly showed up at the police station and requested to speak with an officer. This time, he didn't deny having contact with Gabriela. He said he knew where she was. What followed was a confession that changed everything. According to his statement, on the evening of July 29th, he met with Gabriela as he had done before. That night, they got into an argument. Nestor claimed the fight escalated into a physical altercation, during which he lost control and caused Gabriela's death by manual strangulation. He provided the exact location of her body, stating that he had hidden it in his room at the boarding house, wrapped in bed sheets and plastic. He insisted he had acted in a moment of emotional breakdown and hadn't planned the act in advance. Police immediately went to the location he described. Inside the room he had rented, investigators found Gabriela's body. It had been carefully wrapped in multiple layers of fabric and plastic bags and placed in the corner of the room. Forensic specialists were called to the scene. The inspection confirmed that the body had been kept in the room for several days, but showed limited decomposition due to the way it was sealed. Investigators collected all surrounding items for forensic analysis. A preliminary autopsy concluded that the cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation by hand. There were no signs of physical assault with intent of an intimate nature, allowing investigators to rule out that as a motive. Still, the core question remained. If it wasn't an act of aggression for that reason, what led to such a violent outburst? Some theorized the act stemmed from prolonged emotional tension, jealousy, and a loss of control by an adult who couldn't accept Gabriela's growing independence. Only further interviews and psychological assessments could confirm whether this theory held true. Gabriela's family was informed of Nestor's confession by the authorities. The shock was overwhelming. Her mother, stepfather, and other relatives couldn't comprehend that someone they had lived with could be capable of such a thing. The man who had once been seen as a caring uncle had now confessed to ending her life. For many, it wasn't just devastating, it shattered their trust in the people closest to them. Cesar Garcia, Gabriela's stepfather, told reporters he couldn't process what had happened. According to him, Nestor had never shown signs of suspicious behavior, and everyone saw him as a normal relative who could be trusted. Gabriela's sister, Sunilda, did not comment publicly, remaining in a state of shock. Their mother, overcome with emotion, broke down in tears. For the family, grief over the loss was compounded by the feeling of betrayal. Despite Nestor's confession, the investigation continued. Law enforcement needed to verify the truth of his claims and rule out the possibility that he was hiding additional facts. His explanation of an emotional outburst raised doubts, especially given how deliberately he had hidden the body. Investigators also considered the possibility that Nestor was attempting to downplay his responsibility in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. All of this became part of the case as it moved toward trial. Following the confession and discovery of Gabriela's body, Nestor Quintana's case moved into the formal criminal investigation phase, and he was officially charged. But at the very first court hearing, the situation took a turn. Nestor suddenly retracted his confession. He claimed he had been pressured by police, that psychological coercion had been used, and that he hadn't been properly informed of his rights. This new statement became the foundation of his defense strategy. Nestor's attorney moved quickly to challenge all evidence obtained from the confession. He argued that the search of the boarding house had been conducted improperly, without a valid warrant. The defense also pushed to exclude the text messages, voice recordings, and witness testimonies collected before legal representation was present. Their central claim was that Nestor had been in a psychologically unstable state and incapable of understanding the consequences of what he had said. Prosecutors took a firm stance. The lead attorney emphasized that the confession had been both voluntary and detailed, and that Nestor's precise directions to the location of Gabriela's body were too specific to be coincidental. In addition, evidence had been gathered showing a long-standing, controlling dynamic between the accused and Gabriela, including signs of psychological manipulation and jealousy. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was the presence of Nestor's DNA under Gabriela's fingernails, clear proof that a physical struggle had taken place. The courtroom heard testimony from several witnesses. Gabriela's friends described the emotional toll she had suffered in the months leading up to her disappearance, his obsessive control, his restrictions on her social life, and the emotional pressure he exerted. At one point during the proceedings, a message exchange was read aloud in which Nestor issued threats. The content made a strong impression on the jury. The defense attempted to shift tactics. They portrayed Nestor as an emotionally unstable individual who had acted during a moment of intense stress. They claimed that his relationship with Gabriela had been mutual, though informal, and that the act had not been premeditated. These assertions sparked outrage from Gabriela's family. Her stepfather, in particular, expressed his anger publicly after several hearings, stating that efforts to justify the accused were an insult to Gabriela's memory. Throughout the trial, Gabriela's mother, Liliana, kept her emotions in check. She attended every session. The family remained unified in their position. This was not a case of a domestic dispute. It was a betrayal and the loss of a life that had been controlled and suppressed for years. Their legal team framed the case around a betrayal of trust, made worse by Nestor's role as a family member. The prosecution demanded the maximum sentence, life imprisonment, citing the severity of the crime, the familial relationship, the long-term psychological manipulation, and the deliberate attempt to hide the body. After both sides presented their final arguments, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. Gabriela's family sat in silence, waiting. When the jury returned, the foreperson delivered the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, with aggravating factors related to the family connection and gender-based violence. The judge did not delay in delivering the sentence. Nestor Quintana was sentenced to life in prison. The court rejected the defense's claims of coercion, citing the level of detail in his confession and the supporting physical evidence. The added element of long-term psychological control only reinforced the severity of the charges. Nestor showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. His attorneys looked down, silent. On the other side of the courtroom, Gabriela's mother broke down in tears. Her husband wrapped his arms around her. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a painful form of closure. Justice had been served, but their daughter was gone. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.